Okay, everybody, good afternoon. How is everyone doing today?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Good, Naya. Good. Before I forget, at the end of class today, I'm going to ask you guys to do something on your phones or your computer. There's a link I'm going to ask you to go to. So just be sure that when I get to that point, you can find a way to do that. I'm going to ask you guys just to take some time to look at a website, and I'll explain that later on. This is not the evaluation, which is next class. This is something else that's tied into today's lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the screen share. If you can just get ready for that, that would be good. So last class, we talked about the 70s and the 80s and the 90s a little bit. And today we're going to sort of slow down and talk about the transition from 89 onwards. And I think this is going to be a nice way for us to sort of think about the end of Japan's prosperity, and it's sort of the dawn of a new era for Japan. So with no further ado, let's do that. Okay. So Japan's prosperity in terms of economics and in terms of everything besides the birth rate was just so astounding. And so what we see is that the end of the 80s sort of brought this to a halt. And before things begin to get really bad in Japan, I want to talk about I want to sort of remind everyone that this is the end of the Showa period. Emperor Hirohito comes with the emperor's death in 1989. And as I mentioned last class, this was a big, very public event, and that the response that the people in Japan had to the death of Hirohito as a reminder of what Japan had gone through in some ways, and as continuity with the pre-war period, they were mixed. The funeral cortege was very large and very public, and the Imperial Guard, as well as the self-defense forces, they all came out to commemorate and to memorialize, I should say, the deceased emperor. So from that point on, Japan enters a new era. This is the Heisei era, with a new emperor who we'll talk about in a little bit, Akihiko. But the turning the page for Japan did not necessarily lead right away to positive things. So the 1990s really are defined in many Japanese sort of history books as the so-called lost decades. What you see is a lot of the people, a lot of the structures that were in place that bolstered Japan's miraculous economic growth, they crumbled. And I'm going to talk about that, but also some of the ways in which that the society as a whole encountered some pretty crazy and difficult times. So first and foremost, the continued growth of even into the 80s comes to a quick halt. But after this happens, the LDP, which had been sort of looking and overseeing, supervising, and managing this growth, they finally, for the first time, really lose power. In this sort of same time period, we also have some catastrophes, both national and man-made, that are going to lead Japan to a period of reflection and looking towards how the future can be shaped. So the 80s, by the end of the 80s, had just really given Japan such prosperity. It was really quite incredible. We discussed last class, some of the major purchases that were taking place. Sony buying Columbia, and the different wealthy magnates of Japan who were buying high-profile real estate in the United States. So Japan's stock market, the Nikkei, in volume, it tripled between 87 and 89, which is actually not a good sign when it happens that quickly. And behind this, we have a very rapid increase as well in the price of real estate and of land in general in Japan. And it doubles in the early 80s, and then it doubles again in the late 80s. So by the time we get to 1989, and Emperor Hirohito is on his deathbed, we can really see that this is not a stable and sustainable kind of growth that Japan is going through. Behind the price doubling, of course, is a lot of speculation. People buying land for prices that are above what it's worth, with the hopes that it will then become worth that. And this can go on for so long, but eventually, to make this work, we see banks giving out loans for projects that are not well thought out, not well supported, not going to actually happen. And we see individuals also taking big risks with their credit and not always succeeding in paying off loans. And we see the number of credits being given out, number of loans being given out, just sort of skyrocket. Meanwhile, the credit worthiness of these people and these companies, some of them small, some of them large, is oftentimes shady at best. And so this sort of continues, and because things are going so well, it sort of keeps going on. But by I think by 89 or so, we have lots of indicators that this was not sustainable, and the result is that from about 89, when banks call in these loans, they're unable to get payments back because people have made poor investments. They were bad credit risks. These sort of typical kinds of things, and real estate projects that were humongous and expensive that never materialized. They also are going to end up not paying the banks back. So this leads to very quickly speculation the other direction, and a sort of the bursting of the bubble in Japan. And so from 1991, 92 or so, this sort of reaches its depths, its nadir, and then for the next 8 or so years, Japan is going to be in a period of economic decline or stagnation. Part of what's interesting about this is that the reason the LDP was able to keep power so long was that Japan was doing so well. They had managed Japan's growth. They had engineered some of that growth. And we talked about the Iron Triangle, which the LDP was a big part, obviously. This was a very successful system. When that system failed, when men who were working as salarymen were laid off, which was a big surprise to the salarymen and to their families, when families as a whole had to deal with single income or sometimes no income in the early 90s because of the consequences of all this growth and then the bubble bursting. What we see is that the country lost faith in the LDP. And as we'll see, it was brief, but it was definitely a shock. And they looked for other alternatives and they embraced them. And meanwhile, in the national diet, socialists, the Clean Government Party, which is the Komeito, another anti-corruption party in the government, as well as the Social Democratic Party, they all were able to get new voters on their side, and they created a coalition actually, and they got the first non-LDP prime minister elected in '92. And here we see him. This is Hosokawa Morihiro. So this is a sign of Japan being open to new ways of governance, new individuals, new organizations, but also a sign of fear about the future of Japan. And those fears, they came out of this quick turn towards economic depression and stagnation, but they also came, sort of as a system that was in place that had worked for almost half a century came tumbling down. Things get worse for Japan. And I want to talk about two events that are pivotal to Japan's economic stagnation and the general population's lack of faith in government and their worry about the future for Japan. Of course, meanwhile, the low birth rate continued throughout the 90s to be a lingering source of worry as well, but that was not new to the equation. The Great Kobe earthquake, or the Hanshin earthquake, January 1995, was an enormous earthquake, and it killed more than 6,000 people in the area of Kobe, which we can see here on this map. This was, the biggest earthquake that Japan had had to endure since the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and people, the losses for the country were much less. But given the situation in Japan at the time, it was traumatic, and it was especially difficult for Japan's economy. Here we can see Kobe. Kobe, if you know anything about Japan, is sort of one of the workhouses, the busy industrial city in Japan, like a Chicago or like a major city like that, but not quite New York, or not quite in this case, not quite Tokyo. So it was a major hit for Japan on that front. The same year, another catastrophe occurred in Japan. This was in Tokyo. A new religious group called Aum Shinrikyo, led by Asahara Shoko, who we see here, a blind prophet and leader of this religious movement that pulled from various different faiths, some of them sort of shamanistic, some of them more sort of Zen Buddhist adjacent. But it was a very sort of millenarial kind of movement that foresaw the end of the world, and that the people who belonged to this organization, this movement, were going to help usher in the end of the world, usher in this new millennium, this new world. And they orchestrated and carried out an attack that was meant to shock the world, rebuff the West and all of their tentacles that were so deeply implanted in Japan. And as we've seen, they really were, right? With military bases, with the nuclear umbrella, with the military umbrella, with the culture of Japan being so inundated with Western products and people and patents. This was not a made-up sort of anti-Western enemy. There was a very strong Western presence in Japan, which this group was trying to fight against. And so, acting on the vision of Asahara Shoko, they released sarin gas, which is a poisonous, deadly gas, in the subway in Tokyo in March of '95. So we have these two almost back to back, right, in January and then in March, catastrophes that just sort of, they kind of finished Japan off. I think that the people in Japan by June, they had already seen so much chaos, and they were so afraid of the subway. They're afraid of taxi cabs. We see the country was still in shock, and this is still sort of, Japan was still reeling from all of these things, and the economy still was not doing very well. So it was a hard time for Japan at that point. And what we see is that, perhaps surprisingly, that the people of Japan lost faith in their current government yet again. This coalition of the Clean Government Party and the Social Democratic Party, and they in fact are trying to find something to hold on to, some stability. And they in fact turned back to the LDP in '96. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and talk about a figure who is sort of he epitomizes the return of the LDP, even though this happens in 2000. But he also brings in a new era for Japan. So as Japan turns into the 21st century, the prime minister is Koizumi, I'll show you a picture of in a second, Junichiro, who is a career politician from the LDP, but who has big plans for Japan. He wants to see Japan fully recover economically, and he oversees that. He would be the sort of third or fourth LDP prime minister from the LDP to oversee this move towards recovery for Japan. But he is sort of the pinnacle of this movement. He wants to see Japan also retake its place as an international and global power. And he also wants to see Japanese national identity again front and center, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a source of pride. So he prioritized lowering the spending of the government, lowering the government's debt, indebtedness, with great success. And so I think we can sort of credit him with finishing the sort of the pulling of Japan out of its mire of stagnation. He also really wants to turn the self-defense forces that Japan has and was mandated to find to create by the reverse course, and make it a tool that could help Japan's international prestige and position. And so, in fact, he is the prime minister who sends for the first time Japan's self-defense forces overseas. In this case, to go act as observers and helpers and non-combatants in in Iraq. Of course, supporting the United States and other countries that are fighting in Iraq. He also carries through the privatization process, trying to carry on the legacy of Nakasone, who I mentioned last class. He privatizes the post office and the postal bank, which again unburdens to some extent the Japanese government, and ultimately creates a really an efficient way for people to save money, keep their money and save money, but also to have their mail delivered. But perhaps he's most famous today for his sort of just unabashed open embrace of nationalism in Japan and patriotism. And he, in fact, is even going to visit Yasukuni Shrine as prime minister 6 times. And here we can see him visiting in prime minister dress, but we also can see him another time 2 years later visiting in traditional Japanese dress as well. So he is someone who looks at East Asia, which the countries that are calling for Japan to recognize its wartime atrocities, and he looks at their relationships, which are with Korea, with South Korea, with China, that are so tied to trade. But he's willing to jeopardize or at least weaken those relationships in order to present Japan as a strong country with a strong history that is not worth being at all ashamed of. So the 2000 to 2010 period in Japan is actually sort of a moment of rebirth. The economy has gotten back on its feet. Japan has an international presence. Even its military has an international presence. The LDP, for the most part, stay in power. There's another dip, but they mostly stay in power. And they embrace the least controversial of the demands from the left in order to stay in power. But the 2010s, again, are going to bring Japan a lot of difficulty. I want to talk about a couple of different things here. 2 more shocks. We use this term shocks a lot in this class because I think the shocks from the 70s, the 2 Nixon shocks, for example, the 4 shocks from the 2000s being the bursting of the bubble, being the surprise LDP loss to a coalition government, and being the Great Kanto earthquake, the Great Hanshin earthquake in Kobe, and also the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo. And so the 2000 to 2010 period is a bit of a respite, but then we have again more shocks. The first is actually a global shock that comes and really affects Japan. This is I'm sure you know this story quite well, the Lehman shock, they call it. It is another story of bad investments, poorly thought out, poorly planned, unverified investments and loans and credit giving processes. The speculation of this market was so big that, in fact, the actual amount of equity to assets, the ratio was 131 to 1, which is very bad, right? If you can imagine that if someone were to call in one of these loans or credit, what they actually would have, right? The value of their good, it would be a sort of a dissonance between their assets and the actual value of their assets. And what we also see is that the real estate is the industry where this was the worst. There was a movie a few years ago called The Big what's it called? Anyway, a good movie, very good movie. The Big Short. It's called The Big Short. And it explains very well, I think, in about 2 minutes how all this happened. But at the heart of all this are loans that are being made and credit being given to people who have poor credit, and then those loans are sold again and again and again, and each time their rating or the quality of that loan and the loanee is given a higher and higher rating, even though they're actually not very good for the money. So this process will obviously explode and lead to the fall of one of Japan's, the U.S.'s top trading investment firms, Lehman Brothers, but others as well. And this actually has enormous consequences for Japan as well. It's a big shock. But I would say that Japan was better prepared, having gone through so much in the early 90s for this, and they actually are beginning to recover. But during the depths of Lehman shock, we have people who were so bad off that they had to live in tents, which in Japan happens very rarely. People are really in public with their poverty and their indebtedness. And we had in Tokyo, there was an entire tent village in Hibiya Park, which we've discussed before as a very important place to gather in Tokyo, right in front of the Imperial Palace. And there was, for over a year, this sort of agglomeration of all of these tents, people who could not afford to pay rent in the middle of Tokyo, because of the repercussions of the fall of so many companies and banks in the US, but also in Japan. Japan exports, they dropped 40% over the course of 2008, 2009. And it was very bad, right? So, so in 2009, again, sort of worried about Japan's future, Japan's electorate, they again look for other options. The LDP has again failed them. This time they turned to the Democratic Party of Japan, a relatively new party. And this party is able on its own to defeat the LDP for a few years. They have the most seats in the upper and lower house of the Diet, and they really just trounced the LDP. And so this party is the one that is going to try and usher in a little bit more. The government's going to be more helpful, more not quite socialist, but thinking about the welfare of citizens and having that be the burden of the government. So this process, they get going, and recovery by 2010 has already begun to happen. Lehman Brothers and the global crisis that came from that catastrophe. And this is Prime Minister Hatayama Yukio, who was the grandson of the first post-war Prime Minister, Hatayama Ichiro, and who was sort of the face of this new, more benevolent, right, more popular Japanese government. Now I'm going to actually take a step back here and talk about something that, before we get to 2011, I want to build up to it again and talk about how Japan got to this point. I asked you all to do some reading and to take and to do a response paragraph about this process. And I think it's important for us to take a second and sort of just let it sink in. Japan was the only country attacked by nuclear in 1945. And then US nuclear testing in 1954 resulted in in an unpredicted fallout from Bikini Atoll that ended up irradiating Japanese fishermen on a boat, one of whom actually died, and others who suffered radiation poisoning for the rest of their lives on the Lucky Dragon fishing vessel. Big news. And the pictures here of scientists measuring the radiation with the Geiger counter of the fish from this boat. It was a big deal. So how do we go from this, right, to what happens in 2011? How do we go to Japan being one of the leading advocates and practitioners of nuclear power in the world? And what I asked you to think about was sort of this process. So let's talk a bit about this now. The big catalyst for nuclear in Japan, in terms of outside pressure and influence, was, of course, the United States. President Dwight Eisenhower envisioned a nuclear future, and he believed in the U.S. As a leader in this nuclear future, but it would be cleaner. And he wanted Japan to be an ally that supported nuclear power as well. And so the U.S. Was important, but he wanted this to be a global movement. And he, in fact, gives us, he, in fact, is going to sort of sell this idea to Japan and to the world that we have to figure out either we need to make nuclear energy into a force for good or for destruction. And he also promises that Japan will benefit from nuclear isotopes from the US if they choose to pursue nuclear power. He launches a program called Atoms for Peace, and he goes to the UN and makes a big speech and explains that this our choice as humanity is to embrace nuclear power as a force for destruction or for growth and building things. And much of the world is interested in this, but Japan and France are extremely convinced by this argument. And let's talk a bit about why they were so convinced. They required a lot of convincing, obviously, in the US for people to not be afraid of radiation, and rightfully so. They had to sell this idea as one that was safe. And the same was Japan. The same was true for Japan as well. But the Japanese, they really were worried about nuclear anything, and they had what historians have referred to as a nuclear allergy. They didn't want to talk about nuclear power, nuclear weapons, nuclear anything in Japan, and I think understandably so. And so there was a very persuasive and sort of direct campaign to promote nuclear energy in Japan. And we have scientists who are, nuclear scientists who are part of this. We also have a lot of big companies that are part of this as well, and major TV stations in Japan, both public and private stations. They're all going to be sort of on board with this project. There will be sometimes entire new buildings are built to showcase how nuclear power works and why it's safe. There were movies, and there were lots of talks and lectures, and there were people who were even paid to go out and and just talk to the public about nuclear energy in general. And we see that this takes about 5 or 6 years, but it really is successful. People in Japan change their mind, or at least many of them do. We'll still have groups like Gensuikyo who are going to be adamantly against nuclear energy or nuclear weapons in Japan. But there is a large portion of the population that is convinced by the possibility for this. And we do see them embrace this idea, right? And looking towards the future where nuclear will be the future, will be the most modern. And this may be the place also, some in politics would argue, where Japan can make its mark in the world. Japan can be the cleanest country, the greenest country, the country that has the least pollution, and they can do this through nuclear energy. And some of the most interesting efforts to popularize nuclear energy were sort of indirect. They were the popular media, sort of pop culture discussions about nuclear energy and nuclear power, softening attitudes that had been for so long against nuclear anything in Japan. And Tetsuwan Atom or Astro Boy is sort of the poster child of this movement in the 50s to romanticize nuclear power. Here we can see Astro Boy, who of course was powered by nuclear energy. So Japan really, I think, faced a difficult situation. They needed to find a way to get energy. And Japan has, so many rivers, but the rivers in Japan are mostly not large, enormous, powerful rivers. They're mostly medium and small sized rivers, and they'd already been dammed for hydroelectric power up to capacity. They'd reached their maximum there for the most part. And so the option of having a nuclear energy, which could be located in various parts of Japan, and that could provide energy that would not take any more of a toll on Japan's rivers and the water level was very attractive. And again, I mentioned a little while ago that this was going to be Japan's way of helping the world, of ushering in a new future for the world and being sort of at the forefront of this new technology. And in '64, an important step sort of began to sort of take place, which was to differentiate and distance nuclear power from nuclear weapons. The three non-nuclear principles is actually a sort of a pact that several countries took together, and Japan adopted these principles in '67. They would not manufacture or possess or allow nuclear weapons on Japanese soil, even those of the United States. And so this was a way to sort of definitively separate nuclear energy from nuclear weapons, and to commit Japan to not at all involving itself with nuclear weapons. And even as in the 80s and in the late 70s and 80s, as sometimes things happened that showcased the fallibility, right, of nuclear systems for energy, and what could happen, including 3 Mile Island in the U.S. and then Chernobyl in '86, very well publicized nuclear accidents. Japan continued to build new plants and to rely heavily upon this as their main source of electricity. This map here shows all of Japan's reactors in 2011, and you can see that there are a lot of them. You can also perhaps see that a lot of them are close to the sea, which is useful for cooling reasons. But also a lot of them are located a little bit outside of the more populous areas nearby, and they're in rural areas for the most part. Even when they're near urban areas, they're at the rural extremity of that urban zone. So on March 11th, 2011, a tremendous magnitude 9 earthquake struck the Japan sea side, excuse me, the east side of Japan. And the earthquake, which originated out in the ocean, sent a 35 to 40 meter tall tsunami, or a great wave, that crashed into Japan. So this leads to, obviously, immediately, right? It's a tsunami. It leads to tens of thousands of dead in the wake of this tsunami. It leads to the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people all over the area I'll show you in a second, on the east coast of Japan. But most importantly for today's discussion, it leads to Japan's biggest, and in fact, probably the costliest nuclear disaster in world history. We're talking about 25 trillion yen, which is a lot of money. we're talking about, I'm not really good with the sort of the numbers here, but we're probably talking about billions of dollars. Let's see how many billions would that be. I think $250 billion, maybe. I'm not, well, you have to look that up, but you can go on Google and look it up, but it's a lot of money, right? And Japan as a whole is still suffering from the radiation from this, but they're also still as a country dealing with the aftermath of this disaster. So what happened? What happened to make this disaster happen? Here is the epicenter of the earthquake, and it's a number that then hits northeastern Japan here, which is an area that unfortunately has been sort of treated as a backwater, as a sort of a periphery within within Honshu, within Japan's main island, for over a century. People who went to live in Manchukuo, or before that in Manchuria, or in Korea, people who joined the military, people who turned to prostitution, all of these different kinds of occupations and displacements, people in those various sort of trends largely came from this part of Japan. And so here, a century later, we have them bearing the brunt of the tsunami, but also the repercussions of having this reactor located in their backyard in Fukushima. So this is a picture of the ways that they crashed over and into eastern Japan, and you can see they're just devastating. And this is a picture of Fukushima Daiichi, the reactor that led to the most important part of the damage of this disaster. So what happened is actually quite simple. The companies, in this case, TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, they built this reactor, and they built a wall to keep just in case, a seawall to keep out seawater. And of course, the water is actually used to cool the reactors when needed, right? So this is a normal thing, but they don't want water to come over this seawall. The seawall was built and it was not tall enough. So that's what happens is this tsunami it goes over the seawall and it destroys the generator system, which is supposed to cool down the reactor, and the reactor is unable to do that, and then it just gets hotter and hotter, and then it explodes and blows up, and then the plume and the fallout from this are the heart of the great March 11th disaster. So this image here shows where Fukushima is here, not far from the coast. And then here you can see that the radiation will travel all the way within less than a week over to the east coast of the United States. And debris that was tested still had radiation levels in 750 rads realm. This is a moment also of national shock, and we have the country sort of in mourning right away. We have the governor of Tokyo calling this tenbatsu, or a divine punishment, soon afterwards, that Japan has strayed too far from its ideals, and this is punishment from heaven. So it was really a terrible moment for Japan. Now, what happens afterwards? Of course, the country has to figure out how to get through, but also how to understand this catastrophe. The Emperor Akihito, he makes a broadcast, and these people in reflection about this tragedy, and we see a really impressive network of Buddhists and Christians and Shinto priests and youth groups from all over the country rushing to go and try and help people from this area. The Japan Self-Defense Force is also deployed. We do see, unfortunately, some finger pointing among politicians that does delay some of the aid, but the people involved, I would say, as a whole, were very efficient in trying to help out people from this area. And the last step is figuring out what went wrong. And one of the things that we now understand is that in 2008, a specialist warned TEPCO that this was the wall that was in place at Fukushima Daiichi it could be overcome by a wave, a tsunami. Would have to be like a very rare kind of tsunami, but one that had, in fact, according to his research, had happened before in the 12th century, I think it was. I can't quite see on my screen, doesn't show that. Yeah, so the 10th century. But they disregarded his recommendation and didn't make the wall taller. That may have helped save, trillions of yen, but also tens of thousands of lives as well. So what I wanted to ask you guys to do now is take a second. If you're kind of zoning out, you can zone back in. I want to ask you to go to this website here, jdarchive.org, and type in one of these keyword pairs. And this is actually the Harvard University digital archive of the 3/11 disaster. And it's a repository for all kinds of great things in terms of, that give great insight into the experience of Fukushima and its consequences for Japan. So yeah, just type it in, type in something that interests you if you're interested in Buddhism or food or water quality. And I'm going to ask you guys to tell me what you find. Okay, so I'm just going to call on people and see if you feel like telling us what you were able to sort of quickly look at and locate in this archive. So if your screen is on, it's easier, but I'll just see what I can get. Let's see. How about, are you there, Eamon?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you have a chance to look at one of these
Yep,
disaster archive?
I looked up Shinto Fukushima, and
Okay.
the first article I found here caught my eye. The headline is "Spring Festival Returns to Town That Evacuated in Nuke Disaster." So
Yeah.
it says that 8 years after the Fukushima nuclear disaster unfolded, the Spring Festival Tantan Pero Pero returned, and let me see here. I was reading the article still.
Yeah.
The festival prays for an abundant harvest and good fortune, and it was suspended for 8 years after the disaster, but returned for the first time in 2019.
That is great to hear. Well, thank you for that. That's very positive, I would say. That's a ray of hope. Thanks for that, Eamon.
Yep.
How about Ellie? I see your face up there. Have you had a chance to look for an article?
Yes. Well, it was actually something thing that I found that caught my eye. I was was that at the heading is former students return to earn to school 7 years after the nuclear disaster, and in the article below, one particular student, Yuki, who was in second grade at the time of the disaster and is now 15, went back and actually found her instrument that she played in school at the time still being there, and I thought that was very powerful, in that, like, even though they had to evacuate and were only just then allowed to go back, like, many of the things that had been left behind were still there and they were able to find them again. I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this wasn't, this was it's being updated all the time, Reddit, with new articles and things. And so it's really interesting to hear the return of people. This wasn't the case 2 years ago when I first started looking at the archives in depth. So this is really great to hear. So thank you for that. That's great. Let's see. How about, are you there, Ali? Ali Christophic, are you there? No. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
I see.
I'm here.
Okay. Do you have a chance to look for one of the articles?
Yeah, I just searched biology Fukushima because I like science.
Sure.
And I found an interesting article that said thyroid cancer diagnosed in 104 young people in Fukushima, which I thought was because it says it's a disease often caused by radiation exposure, and so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so we're seeing the repercussions. We're seeing the return to life. We're also seeing that the disaster is not over yet. It's still ongoing, and the consequences are still very present with people who live in the area. So I think this was a nice chance just to get sort of a taste of what's happening in Japan over the past couple of years around this topic. And so I mentioned Japan has gone through so much in the 2010s. 2011 in particular. And now we're in a difficult phase again. But as I think some of these stories show, Japan is also, they've endured a lot over the past century. And so they are, moving and adapting and finding ways to keep living. And that, I think, is one of the things that is going to keep happening in Japan, between the birth rate and nuclear disasters and COVID and earthquakes and sarin gas attacks. The Japanese citizens, residents are going to keep living and making it, and finding ways to live and to thrive. So next class we'll talk about the last few years in more depth, and I'm going to ask you guys to do a very brief, informal, for my purposes only, survey on the class. So please be sure and be here for that. Otherwise, thank you guys for a great class today and for being here, for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you for our last class with me on Thursday. Thank you again and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.